The next sort of watershed is the arrival of the printing with movable type, an invention of the 1450s. Now, as you may or may not know, printing was not an immediate success. Most early printers went bankrupt. It's fine, you can produce lots and lots of books, but actually you haven't got a different market. There are more people who can read, and you're producing them all in one town. You haven't got a distribution network. By the 1490s, when printing has found its stride, books begin to become more readily available and a little bit cheaper. And we can see a change in the provision in university libraries. I said at the height of its peak before printing, for 1440, the Cambridge University Library had 330 volumes. Luther's university, Wittenberg, was brand new in the early 16th century. Within 10 years, buying printed books, it had got over 600. So it sort of shows how books were more accessible and you could collect things that you wanted. Equally, if we look at individuals, what was a typical individual collection in the Middle Ages? About 20 books. Chaucer describes Nicholas, a student at Oxford in the Reeves Tale. He has 20 books at the head of his bed, and that's about typical for a professional in the Middle Ages. Typical in the 16th century with printed books would be about 100. What doesn't really change, though, is who has access to them. The same people, teachers, lawyers and doctors, buy books, and they buy more of them. It's not as if books are spreading further down into society as a whole. Then we get to the Reformation. Well, a changed attitude to many, many old texts. There are several major ways in which the Reformation affects our story. First of all, the dissolution of monastic houses. These, you will remember, were the earliest libraries. Over the centuries, they have built up collections of thousands of books, invaluable texts, but of course, 1538, 1539, they are dissolved. A very small number, monastic cathedrals, remained in situ, and I have to break off to say that the finest still in situ is, as it happens, in Durham, 10 minutes from where I live. So a few were preserved, but on the whole, that incredible 1,000 years of history was scattered. Now, a few private collectors, private individuals, were able to buy and salvage some of the books that were scrapped from the dissolved monastic houses. Matthew Parker, Queen Elizabeth's Archbishop, he collected about 500 of them, and he was interested in historical texts and did the rounds of various monastic houses, collecting things he thought of interest to English history. On the other hand, Richard Bancroft, who founded Lambeth Palace Library, he hoovered up whole job lot collections. For instance, the fairly mediocre library at Lantony Priory in Gloucester, he got most of it, collected most of it, and it's now on the shelves of Lambeth Palace Library. So there's a vast loss, a certain amount passing into the hands of private collectors of the monastic library. What about the university libraries? What happens then? They are purged brutally because of the many theological books that they have in their collections. So punitive was the effect on the Bodleian Library in Oxford that we're told that in the mid-16th century they sold some of their bookshelves because they didn't need the shelving anymore. Now, I don't know whether you believe in hell, and I probably don't, but it's probably just about worth believing in order to hope that Henry VIII is in it. Because Henry VIII, not only was he responsible for this vast destruction of English culture, he absolutely failed to garner these resources. Yes, he enriched himself with the spoils from the monasteries, but some of his advisors, John Leyland, begged him to save these resources and turn them into a national library. And what wealth and riches we'd have if he had done it, but he didn't. So what survives depends entirely on chance and private initiative. And as we move into the 16th and to the 17th century, we can see some of those private collections, individuals buying printed books for themselves, hoovering up what they could from monastic libraries and dissolved university libraries, turning in their turn into university and institutional libraries, some of which still survive. I mentioned Bancroft. His books in 1610 became Lambeth Palace Library. A case close to home for me was John Cuson, a bishop of Durham, who collected books from the north of England, who collected books. He had an agent in London buying older books from the London market, and equally he had a period of exile in France when he collected books. When he died in 1672, he wanted his books to become a public library in the north of England for clergy within the Diocese of Durham. And the room he left money to build, he left 5,000 books, so larger probably than any monastic library. And the books and the library are still there as he set it up. And most of the collections formed in the 16th or 17th century stand behind many of the great libraries that we would recognise today. Lambeth, bits of the British Library, the Bodleian Library, as I say, John Cusson's Library in Durham. Now, Cusson's Library, it was a public library, that's how it was founded, but it was for clergy of the diocese and other worthies. Now, he didn't say other worthies, what that meant. I suppose you knew a worthy when you saw them, if you were the librarian. But don't worry, you know, if you were not worthy, the collection probably wouldn't interest you anyway, because of his 5,000 books, more than half of it was theology in Latin. Most of the remainder was religious controversy in French or Latin. Almost all of what remained was in French, because he preferred reading French to English. Who wouldn't? There were 2 works in English, the first folio of Shakespeare and a 1610 edition of Chaucer. So presumably, you know, he was aiming high. Another example of the same sort of phenomenon nearer to where we are, in 1684, Thomas Tennyson of St Martin's in the Field, he set up a public library. And his motives for doing it perhaps suggest that the clergy in London in the late 17th century weren't of the same calibre of the clergy in Durham. He specifically said he was doing this in order to tempt curates in London out of the taverns and into something decent. So, you know, what a worthy thing. And the last of these examples of great private collections sort of moving to become institutional ones, when Bishop John Moore of Ely died in 1715, he had a large collection of books, and it was bought by King George I. And George bought it to give to Cambridge University Library to restock the shelves that had been so depleted in the 16th century. Why Cambridge, not Oxford? Well, perhaps Oxford, you know, had a better library already. Actually, Cambridge was more favourably inclined to George, Oxford less so, and at the same time as the George was giving the library to Cambridge, he was sending troops to Oxford. Oxford had a professor of poetry called Dr. Trapp, and he wrote a little poem about this, which, you know, had they written graffiti in those days, and I'm sure they were too erudite to do so, this would have been on all the telephone boxes around Oxford at the time. Contrary methods justly George applies to govern his 2 universities. To Oxford sent a troop of horse. Why? That learned body wanted loyalty. To Cambridge he sent books, just as well discerning how much that loyal body wanted learning. And a nice sort of sense of wanted from an Oxford man. As we move into the 18th and 19th century, we can begin to see a broader range of provision. At the top, if you like, of the hierarchy, there are national reference collections. There are 2 if we discount Cambridge, and who wouldn't. The Bodleian Library, the first national library of England, had been refounded by Thomas Bodley in the 17th century and functioned as a national library. The British Museum Library appears in 1753 and then gradually draws even with the Bodleian and gradually past it. So 2 national reference libraries.